Chili?
All right, camera.
Hang on. Okay, just wanted the door to close.
Speed.
Good. Do we want to do a name and spell it, or?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Can you tell us your name and spell it?
My name is John Kevin Foster, John Kevin Foster, but I go by Kevin, my middle name.
Kevin, so tell me a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm nearly 63 years old right now. I come from a very large Irish Catholic family. I'm the oldest of 9. Grew up in Detroit, educated in a Jesuit school in Mobile, Alabama, and started my career in public accounting, which eventually got me into real estate over the years. And during that time, I sold a lot of commercial real estate, spent a lot of time in the industry, in the business, and eventually I had a friend, or actually a client, that asked me to join his company as executive vice president of his real estate company.
Tell me a little bit about your life today. Are you a little bit more detail about your life today?
We live in the suburb of Atlanta called Roswell, Georgia, with my wife and 2 kids. Christine and I have been married for 16 and a half years, very happily married over that time period. We were very much bonded in our lives. She is a real estate agent, and since I've been out of prison, it's been very difficult for me to earn a living. Prior to going to prison, I was the primary breadwinner, but Christine had to take over that role.
So you mentioned prison. Tell me a little bit about how your life unfolded that led you to spend some time in prison, and for how long?
Well, when I was working for the real estate company, I was based in Atlanta, but we had a project, a large project in North Carolina, in mountains of North Carolina. And that project failed in 2007. In the course of that failure, the investors complained to the North Carolina Attorney General's office, as well as to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's office in Charlotte. And they investigated the failure of that project, and they accused the company of defrauding the investors. So since I was an officer of the company, I was also caught up in the whole mess. And over the course of a couple-year investigation, I was bled dry. I was given the opportunity to plead guilty rather than going to trial. So I pled guilty to 1 count of conspiracy. That ended up with a 48-month prison sentence, of which I actually served 37 months.
That must have been obviously a big change in your life, and a big blow to your family and to your own self and your own ego. Tell me a little bit about your adjustment to prison. What was that like?
I'll never forget walking into prison the very first day. I was a self-report, which means that my wife drove me to prison. I wasn't shackled from sentencing. We drove to prison, went through the front doors. People were totally unfriendly, and started going through the process of processing me. And after that processing, essentially I was told to go to this dorm. Well, I had no clue where this dorm was or anything along that line, and they said, well, go through that door right over there. And I opened up that door, and there was this huge yard, and I could see these buildings in the background, and these high electrical fences. And I thought, man, this certainly is not Roswell, Georgia anymore. I felt like Dorothy being dropped down in Oz, or the whole being dropped down the rabbit hole. It was totally foreign to me. And I started looking around, and there's all these weird people, and they were all dressed the same in khakis. And the guards were all dressed in blues, and they weren't calling them guards, they were calling them COs, and I didn't even know what CO meant. someone had to tell me what that meant. And I've soon learned that I had to learn a whole new language and get along with a whole new different group of people that I never thought. And I just kept on asking myself, why am I here? Why am I here?
Let me build off that a little bit, because I'm wondering how, I'm sure there was a ton of emotion prior, I mean, through the whole investigation and that led up to you actually physically walking in there. Tell me a little bit about the process that you and your wife went through emotionally to prepare you for this experience.
We were both devastated. And it really started when my case was national news and there was a press release. And our attorney read the press release to me as I was landing in Atlanta on a plane. And I knew my life would never be the same. And my wife picked me up from the airport. And I told her what happened. And I said, you know, honey, I said, I just love you too much to put you through the agony that I know is to come. This is going to be 10 weeks, or 10 years rather, of agony. Who knows where this is going to lead? And they're going to take everything we own. So today I will give you a divorce and everything we own, because I just love you too much to put you through it all. And all she could say was, for better or for worse. And I just knew that was true love, and this was the woman that I needed to go on this journey with. But for better or for worse was definitely how it was, because we had umpteen interviews with the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and you walk into their office, it says, USA v. Foster. And you just knew you're in trouble. And finally, we lost our house. We lost a second house. We lost our car. It was like, I am beat up and I cannot do this anymore, but I'm a fighter. And our attorney said, you can fight this if you want, but you're going to lose, because all they have to do is prove conspiracy, which is a phone call, an email, some meeting that you attended. It could be almost anything to tie you to the conspiracy, and then they can nail you with the whole conspiracy. And he said, if you want to fight it, we'll fight it, but I need $650,000 right now in legal fees, and you got to prove to me where you can come up with another $350,000. I was looking at $1 million in legal fees. I already spent $250,000. I couldn't do it. It was just like, cry uncle. And cry, I lied. I did. I cried and cried and cried. How could I possibly put myself in this position? How could I possibly put my family in this position? And then the other thing is that I have this very rare heart disease. I shouldn't even be alive. And now I gotta spend my life in prison, you know, when I should be spending it with my wife. It's just not fair. This is not what I signed up for.
So Kevin, tell me a little bit about, you talked earlier about hitting that compound, hitting that prison. Tell me a little bit about the emotional journey, through an overview of the emotional journey through your time, through your incarceration.
Well, my first 2 weeks in prison, I was confused, angry, and afraid. There was all these weird people like walking around, and actually the inmates were a lot more friendlier to me than the guards were. The guards were extremely rude to me. And that I had a hard time, because I've always respected authority. And it was very difficult to respect authority when I was in prison. And so that lack of respect to authority just made me madder and madder. And then you'd have conflicts with other inmates. And that made me madder and madder. And then one day, I saw one of my co-defendants at this prison. And that was not supposed to have happened. And this is compounded by the fact that I was actually supposed to have been going to a lower security prison, to a prison camp. And instead I was in a low security prison, and he was there. He was a constant reminder of my past. And that was very difficult for me. And I called my wife, and I said, I can't be here with another co-defendant. This just can't work. We had an open case at the time. I asked her to call my attorney, which she did. And a little bit later, a couple days later, the guard comes to my cell, and my cellie and I were there, and she asked us to leave our cell. And I thought they were going to shake down our cell, and my cellie was kind of a bad dude. And I thought they were there to shake him down. I'd only been there for a couple weeks. And I thought, oh God, not again. You know, here I am only just 2 weeks into this thing. And about 5 minutes later, they said, well, come on back to your cell. And this burly lieutenant said, follow me. And I followed him. And I said, well, what's this all about? And he goes, well, when we leave here, I'll tell you. And then when we got outside into the yard, he goes, we are fearful for your life. We're going to put you into segregated housing unit for your own protection.
Whoa.
And I thought, oh no, now what? I mean, I'm only there 2 weeks. And I'm walking across the yard, and everybody's staring with me as I'm walking with this lieutenant. I had no clue what the SHU was. I had only heard that's where they sent all the bad guys. And I started getting mad and even scared. And it was just like one thing compounded after another. And so we entered the SHU, and they put me into a cell by myself, and then they strip searched me. And it was so humiliating. It was so humiliating. And then they gave me an orange jumpsuit, and it was freezing cold in there, and they marched me to the very end of the cell block. They put me in a cell by myself, and there was no other cells occupied anywhere near me. And I was alone, and I was afraid, but I was really, really mad. And I started yelling. I started banging on the doors. I was just totally beside myself. And finally, my case manager came down to see me, and I started yelling at him. I go, there's no way that I should be here. You have to get me out of here. And then I started calling him names as if that was going to help. But I was totally beside myself. I just did not know what to do at that point in time, and he just kind of shook his head and left. And I turned around and went back to my bed, and I said, Kevin, this is not who you are. This is not who you are. It says everything that's going on around you is not who you are. Your anger is not who you are. This has been a huge emotional release. And it was at that moment that I decided that I had to change my life. And for whatever else happened over the next 48 months, I knew that I had to walk out of that prison a different man than who I was that day.
So Kevin, you were at a point, you were talking about a point in your life when you, in the cell, in segregation, kind of really sounds like a little rock bottom moment where you decided that you knew you had to change your life, that this was not you, and this was not going to define you. Tell us a little more about that and what happened next.
Well, after I had the epiphany that I needed to change my life, that I needed to make my journey mean something to me and to anybody else, I actually reverted back to something I had been doing for a long period of time, which was transcendental meditation. I had been meditating since 1974, so for over 40 years I had meditated every day. And I found that place where I can go inside. And when I entered prison, I was too embarrassed to meditate in a room that had 160 people in it. I couldn't find a place by myself. But here I was in solitary confinement for all practical purposes with nobody else around. And that gave me plenty of time to meditate. And I started going inside myself and started looking for answers. And I kept on hearing this little voice saying, you know, just one more step, just one more step, just one more, just take another step. Don't lose faith in what you have to give to yourself and to others, but we'll work on this together. So I would spend 28 days in that solitary confinement without talking to anybody except the cell guards that were there. And those conversations were more like, well, can I have another carton of milk for breakfast, you know, or what about a book, you know? But besides that, I talked to nobody but myself. And so I would spend the 28 days there in solitary confinement, and then eventually I got called and I was told to prepare to move to the low security, not the low security prison, but the minimum security prison, which is also known as a camp. And I was going to move out the next day, and I was told to pack my stuff. Well, I had no stuff. When you're in solitary confinement, they don't give you anything. I had an orange jumpsuit and underwear that had been worn probably 100 times previous to me wearing it. So all that stuff they could have. So there was nothing. I think I brought one book with me, and that was it. And that's all I took out of there was one book. And I was processed out of this solitary confinement with probably about 30 other guys that I could hear their voices down the hall and all, and they were all being transferred to different prisons, and there was like 2 or 3 others that were going to the camp. And so we literally drove a 1/10 of a mile between the SHU and the camp. I mean, they were practically right next to each other with the medium security prison right in between. But it was the first bit of daylight I had seen in a month, and it was a sunny day. And even though I was going to a camp, they handcuffed me, they shackled me. I just walked just like, you know, like this, and I was just beaming with joy that I was finally out of solitary confinement. That I could finally be with other men and just go on with this journey, and now I was more prepared for the journey. But I didn't know where that journey was going to take me. So one thing you learn in prison is that you are welcomed with open arms for the most part by other inmates, because they've all been in the exact same spot. And you start asking questions, and they want to know a little bit about you, where you're from, what do you do, kind of like how'd you get here to begin with. Though it's considered rude to ask what your crime was. You know, you kind of get a sense for who's white collar, you know, and who are the drug dealers, and who's been here for something else, and you start working out your little society within there and your whole friendship. And you say, well, I'm friends, I think I can be friends with this guy, and I can be friends with that guy, but I can't be friends with that guy, you know? So all the judgments that I ever had before going to prison, I certainly brought with me to prison. And those judgments were actually walling me off from other people who eventually would become really good friends of mine. But that's what I did. And when I start talking to other people about their journey, it says, well, you know, I need to be able to cope in different ways. I need to be able to figure out how to survive. And all these different inmates were giving me suggestions on how to survive. And how to survive in prison also means how to get the stuff that you want while you're in prison, primarily food, because the food is crap. And so you got to be able to eat, you got to be able to exercise, and you start developing all these different routines, and all this becomes part of that prison journey.
So what would you say your next step was? Because I like how you said that, you just were taking one step at a time, and you acclimated to the camp, and you knew you were coming from a place of wanting to change your life. What was the next step, you think?
Well, I knew that in order to go on with my journey, I had to find context in what I was experiencing. And everyone does prison in their own way. And for me, it was reading. And I read a lot. And I would talk to other inmates about what they were reading. And some of it was self-help, and some of it was just stuff that I was interested in, like fiction, or some of it was just other historical nonfiction. But it was through all this reading that I started to find a little bit more context, in my life. And in a lot of ways, our reading materials were limited. So I would ask my wife to send me books based on what other guys were sending me. And that helped me out, quite a bit. And then I developed friendship with other guys, and we would walk the track for an hour in the morning, an hour in the evening. We would spend time together, and it was through the walking of the track together, which was very symbolic of a journey that we all take, that we started exchanging different ideas on how we coped on our respective journeys. And I find out about their journeys and what they've done, and I find out that I'm not alone. We all have this thing where we want to concentrate on our own problems, but there was other people that had problems too.
So Kevin, I know we were talking about your next steps in your journey, in your incarceration. Tell me a little bit about where you found help or support.
Okay. It was through all my talks with other inmates that eventually I found out about a program that was offered at the camp by our staff psychologist. And I had only, seen her walk around the camp. I really didn't know anything about her at all. But these guys talked so positively about how she was so instrumental on leading them through a period of personal transformation. And I knew this program was for me. And eventually I just stopped her at a copier machine, and I asked her one day, I said, "Look, I've heard so much about your class. I want to be part of it." I said, "When are you going to be doing it again?" She says, "Well, we come up with this just like once a year and all, and I'll put a poster out, and at that time you can apply for it, and maybe you can get in, and maybe you can be a part of it." And I would look eager to the day where I could be part of it. And finally that day came where there was an orientation for this particular group, and there must have been 25 or 30 guys that were part of this orientation, and some guys you can tell were really interested in, and some guys said, this is just not for me. They weren't ready for the amount of introspection that this was going to take. They weren't ready to take the next step of the journey. And quite frankly, I could look at them and I could tell they were comfortable in their own skins and they weren't willing to change. But I was willing to change. I was willing to make a change and step out, but I did not know how to do it, and I knew I needed help.
So tell me a little bit about, if you can, concisely talk a little bit about how you experienced your own transformation through whatever you did in that program.
I think as part of the program, when we started getting into it, I was really open to almost anything, and I was just like taking it in like a fire hose of being shot on me. But there was a barrier that I knew that I had up, and it was through a lot of different prodding and over a long period of time that I had to release that barrier. And part of it was I had to release my ego, my judgments I had for my brothers that were sitting around in this group, for me, that I had to allow myself to make a change that I could not fathom at the time, but I knew it had to be a slower process because I just couldn't do it all at once. But there were some moments where it was like different moments of an epiphany and say, am I really like this? Is what all these guys saying about me really true?
Can you tell me a little bit about what you think others saw you as?
A lot of people saw me as being arrogant, as being very egotistical. I think a lot of that is true. I was very arrogant and I was probably egotistical. I'd always consider myself a very bright person. I had been financially very successful in my life. I could be overly attached to the people who I knew, my physical possessions, who I was, my family, the cars I drove, the houses that I owned, the vacations, the trips, all of that, I was very much attached to it. And I started to define myself by what I owned and who I associated myself and my own intelligence, and said these other people are not worthy. I had separated myself from a lot of different people without even recognizing that I had done it. But I did do it. But I didn't know that. And it was through all the prodding that I received in the group that I recognized that I had walled myself off. I had compartmentalized a good portion of my life. And I was emotionally separate from a lot of people who I thought I was close to, but I wasn't. I had emotional barriers that I had set up, and a lot of them were for my own protection of my own ego, to protect who I was. But I was wrong. And it was only within this group that I was able to open up and discover those things about myself that very few people will recognize and admit to themselves.
So you really had to face sort of what I call the shadow self. You really had to face some things about yourself that you did not either know about, was aware of, or blocked out. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I had different shadows in my life that I was totally unaware of. And it was through the course of this program that these shadows were presented to me. And I actually learned to embrace some of those qualities and say, Kevin, this is just part of who you are. Go ahead and just let down that barrier, but, this is part of you. Embrace it. Maybe you could open yourself up, and maybe you can change, different ways in how you relate to different people. But, it's really hard to change 50 years of previous experience. But once that you're aware that they do exist, then you can learn to live with them. And this is where I learned to live with them. And as I learned to live with my own limitations, I learned to be non-judgmental towards others, because we all have limitations. And we all have shadows. And we all bury different things in our lives. And I was able to see this in other people. And this was a huge, huge transformation for me.
So you're really talking about being in a group of men in prison who reflected back to you, and that was really powerful because you became more aware of different aspects of yourself. I'm wondering if you could recall any one particular moment or incident or experience in the group or on a specific day that really turn things for you when looking at yourself? Might have been a moment of vulnerability, humility.
I can remember, because Dr. Frazer would occasionally, seems like, pick somebody out, and they were going to be picked on that day. And she had this uncanny ability to figure if somebody just doesn't get it. And that person just needs to be confronted. And there were times that I just did not get it. And I was that person that was singled out. And the other 12 guys in the room would go around, and it was just like, beat me up and point out different things to my personality that, oh my gosh, I mean, this is not true. This cannot possibly be true. This cannot possibly be who I am. But the more that it came up, the more honest I had to be with myself. And what I recognized that these guys were doing this not out of meanness or because they hated me or they felt that they were being judgmental towards me. They actually loved me. They wanted me to change. And that is just so difficult in order to recognize that someone could be honest with another person because they love them, especially in a prison. In a prison. Other guys from different backgrounds. Again, we had drug dealers, we had doctors, we had attorneys, we had politicians in our groups. We had all sorts of other people. We were our own little society. But they were reflecting back on me, on who I was, and out of love, they were being honest about me, to help me, to drag me along on this journey. They were helping me. And it took, in reflecting back on, a lot of courage on my part to be able to slay my own dragons, to be able to curb my own ego. But first of all, you need to know what dragons you're supposed to be slaying, because you don't even know what dragons you're supposed to be slaying. And these guys helped me understand who those dragons were. And they were all around me. They were in me. They were who I was. I was my own dragon. I needed to slay myself to be reborn. And that's what this group brought up. All the guys would talk about Dr. Frazer when I started asking about where I needed to go for help on my journey. Dr. Frazer was the staff psychologist that was there. She was also in charge of the drug program for the overall complex. But I wasn't there for drugs. So there was no way for me to meet her and to introduce myself to her unless I went up to Dr. Frazer and said, "Hi, I'm Kevin Foster." And that was the only way I could meet Dr. Frazer.
Great, perfect, thank you. So you mentioned Dr. Frazer mentioned some, the moments, she asked you about the moments that like you felt some shifts, right? Some changes in the group and everything. I just wanted to, one sentence, do you feel like it was a gradual shift or there were moments where there defining moments in your journey in that program?
The shifts I went through the program overall were gradual, but there were certain classes that we had that were more significant than others. Dr. Frazer would use different movies that would try to illustrate a different point, and there was a wow moment. I said, whoa, I really recognize myself in this film, and I mean, I'm like this character right here. And so I would get more out of certain classes than I did others, and there were certain movies or certain books that would speed the journey around. So if the journey was a walk, there were certain times that the journey became a run because, wow, I really was excited about what I was reading or what I was seeing. And that's the way that the shift came to me. It was not one moment, it wasn't gradual, but it was almost like a skip, hop, a jump, and then a walk. And then a full burst of a gallop, and then maybe taking baby steps. And it was probably as many baby steps as there were fast steps. There were times before going through the program where it was very easy for me to get wrapped up in other people's problems, to get wrapped up in other people's emotions and what they were going through. Especially when you're in prison, there's always a lot of drama going on. And all the drama that was going on, I was getting like all wrapped up on it. But once I started going through the program, I started figuring out it was their drama, not mine. I started being on my own path. They were on their own. And so I started separating myself from other people's drama. And then after prison, whoa, then I really learned to separate myself from other people's drama. One thing that you should know is that I have a particular heart disease called ARVD, that the first symptom is sudden death, which usually occurs when somebody is in their late teens or early 20s. And I have survived death many, many times. It used to be that I was admitted in the hospital 4 or 5, maybe even 6 times a year with ventricular tachycardia, ventricular fibrillation, and just nearly died. And so I always wondered, how do I control my heart? How do I make what time I have available in my life the most valuable to me? And I found that I was the only one who could really make those decisions. And I became very rigid as far as my schedule and what I would allow into my life and what I would not allow into my life. And unfortunately, the drug that controlled my heart was a drug called amiodarone, which reacted to the sun, and the drug would crystallize in every organ of the body, and the skin is an organ of the body. So I was walking the track 2 hours a day, and guess what? I had no sunscreen. And so the sun is constantly beating down on my face, and my face was getting blue because all the crystals from the drug were reacting to the sun, and I had this dark blue that was like tattooed into my face. And it was very noticeable. And people would call me the blue man. And they would stare at me all the time. And I had to learn to protect myself, my feelings, my emotions from being so different than anybody else. And being rigid and building these walls all around me helped me protect myself. But those same walls were hurting my relationships with other people. They weren't allowing me to be who I needed to be. The husband, the brother, the friend of all the people in my lives. I couldn't be myself, not who I was. And instinctively, I knew that those walls had to change. But it was Dr. Frazer who would point out those walls to me. Very early on in my prison journey, I realized that I wanted to share my journey with others. So I wrote every day using my the email system that we had. I would write my wife on email, and she would cut and paste every one of my emails and put them in a Word document. And the plan was that I was going to write a book, that I was going to let everybody know about my journey and what I learned from my journey. And as that journey progressed in the camp, it became even more and more important. So I got really excited about writing the book. And I wanted to be able to share my journey with others. And I was going to do that by being an author. So I took a writing class when I got out of prison. I thought, I'm going to write this book. And I'm going to write this book about what I experienced and my transformation and my journey and everything. And when I took the writing class, I realized that there's probably 1/2 of 1% of all writers that actually make money writing books. And I was introduced to a friend and said, look, I still want to tell my story, but I realize that I'm not going to make any money by selling books. And my friend suggested that I become a speaker and that I could use what I learned on my journey to help others on their journeys. And finally, I came to the conclusion that I ended up in prison based on small unethical slips. And I recognize that there are other white-collar guys that are out there that do not realize that small unethical slips can have devastating consequences, including criminal liability. And everybody in the business world should know what this is about. And I decided that I was going to be a speaker, and I was going to be able to help others avoid the fate that I had encountered. After I got released from prison, I felt like a new person. I was able to look at myself and others, very, very differently. And other friends who really didn't particularly care for me before I went to prison saw me as being a new person, someone who was open and caring and not as arrogant and judgmental as I once was before. And that allowed me to be more vulnerable in my discussions. And it also made me recognize that they were all on their own journey, and I can allow them to be on their journey without me interfering. And the fact that I did not interfere with their journey allowed them to be who they are and didn't insert myself into their life. And that really relaxed me. It took a lot of pressure off me. I didn't have to be responsible for everybody else out there, including my wife. It's so hard when you're tied at the hips with somebody else that you really love, and you recognize that this is another human being that is on their journey, and I need to love them exactly the way they are, not who I want them to be. I really recognized through this program how we are all interconnected with one another. And before, my life was one of separation. But I recognized through the program that I went through and in the life that I live now, that there is an interconnection, a perfectness within the universe, that everyone that I meet to either enhance their abilities to see themselves maybe in a different light, or for me to learn something from them, but everyone that I encounter. And I'm very cognizant of the fact that there is a reason why this person is in my life right now and this person is in my life. The universe is absolutely perfect, and how it is to draw all of us together. Ultimately, I found freedom in my prison experience. And who ever thought that you had to be incarcerated in order to find freedom?